All right. Okay, so the lecture that we just listened to was, of course, about COVID, no? And overall, the effect so far. So in terms of the labor market, the workforce, and in the front lines, as well as in the household level and the policy making. So some patterns that we see in gender, no, in gender studies. Now, let's discuss about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and how gender equality is really measured. Now, in the handout posted in Google Classroom, there was a handout posted in Google Classroom on gender equality. So I shall share it. Okay. So here, class, we see the page. It's found on page 30 to 31 in the handout on gender equality here in the Google Classroom, of course. So the UN, as mentioned, not briefly in the lecture previously, the United Nations has identified 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, and the 5th UN SDG is gender equality, achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. So, okay, browsing through the indicators, the United Nations, of course, will be able to measure gender equality based on the following indicators. So the first indicator is end all forms of discrimination against women and girls everywhere. I will show a video, everyone, that will describe this particular SDG. So this video is from the UN itself. However, the clip will be centered around the situation in Kazakhstan because the video is produced by UN in Central Asia. So let's browse through this. We can note most of the indicators for gender equality, namely ending all violence towards women and girls, increasing the role of having gender equality in the household, and increasing the number of women leaders in the world.
In 2015, Kazakhstan, among the other UN member states, supported the 17 Sustainable Development Goals to make the world a better place to live by 2030. The global agenda can be implemented only by using the potential of all humankind. Therefore, the issues of gender equality and empowerment of women are a red thread throughout all the Sustainable Development Goals. For a child to grow and develop harmoniously, not much is needed. Clothing, food and clean water, good sanitary conditions, and basic medicine. Every human being deserves a life free from all forms of violence and discrimination, so elimination of them is among the top priorities in Kazakhstan. Access to affordable and quality education will allow young women to get a decent job. At the same time, it is necessary to recognize and appreciate the unpaid work of women in caring for household and family members, as this work should not interfere with the development and professional growth. Equal distribution of household responsibilities, along with equal protection of labor rights and safe working conditions, will ensure sustainable economic growth in the country. Being in a particularly vulnerable position, women and children first need a safe environment, convenient infrastructure, and a healthy ecosystem. Planning the living environment and caring for the environment is the key to a happy life for future generations. Equal access to justice and equality in social, economic, and political spheres are necessary for the good of the country and the world within the framework of the global international partnership. All 17 Sustainable Development Goals correspond to Kazakhstan's strategic development path, and the responsibility for the implementation of the SDGs lies with all of us. Only together we can make sufficient efforts so that by 2030 our country and beyond will take the path of sustainable development. Not much time remains. Join today. Act now. In 20...
Okay, so that was the video. Now, overall, we are going to review through the indicators one by one. Most of the indicators that were mentioned were, firstly, as mentioned, ending discrimination. So how do we actually measure those indicators for gender equality? So browsing through, to end all forms of discrimination against women and girls everywhere, the measurement of this indicator would be the percentage of women and men, IPs, and local communities with secure rights to land, property, and natural resources. Some of the indicators for ending discrimination would be on the level of including all genders not equally in decision making. That would be an indicator for ending discrimination. For instance, in terms of ownership of land and leadership, have more representation. This also goes for the LGBT. Primary completion rate, secondary completion rates, percentage of seats by women and minorities in national parliament and/or subnational elected office. Another indicator for gender equality would be the elimination of all forms of violence against all women and girls in public and private spheres, including trafficking and sexual and other types of exploitation. So there are many ways, of course, to hinder or to stop discrimination. We mentioned earlier that there is discrimination in gaming in various sectors, such as in terms of at work, no? So there are many businesses and even government offices that are now moving towards hiring more women leaders in management roles or more women in management roles. For a case in point would be IBM, at least that's in America, no? Locally here in the Philippines, due to the emphasis on gender equality in the workplace, most government offices are creating programs within their offices, no, such as DNR and the DILG, in order to really streamline various gender policies in their offices. So with that would be some of the programs that have been done. So the UN would measure that according to data in the national governments of all member states in the world. So they would get data in terms of, is there representation? How about in the sectors, in the smaller sectors that we saw earlier in the barangay level? How can we actually measure that? Perhaps the barangay and the local level government can also try to get information in various sectors and then report it back. So that would be towards the first indicator earlier, gender discrimination in those levels. Then violence against women and girls, to eliminate these forms of violence, including sex trafficking and sexual and other types of exploitation. So to measure that, there would be a decrease in the prevalence of, the measurement would be on the decrease of the prevalence of girls and women who have experienced physical and sexual violence. This will be reported. And the percentage of referred cases of sexual and gender-based violence against women would be investigated and sentenced. So the reporting of these. But earlier we also noted that some women who are victims of violence, particularly at home, do not usually come out and report because it is a family matter. It is often a personal matter. And especially during the pandemic, it isn't really seen as a priority. So the other week, I think that was 3 weeks ago, I attended a talk class attended by some international studies professors in the Philippines na from UP Cebu, from UP Diliman. The talk was about the launch of a book on international studies, and one of the speakers there was from UP Cebu, and that particular professor suggested that today, during the crisis, some projects that can be done to really address violence against women is really to help out NGOs that are already doing projects on VAUSI. So an example would be Balaod, Mindanao. I'm actually trying to see if it's possible for our class to work with Balaod, Mindanao on some gender projects that they're doing. But they proposed that some campaigns can be done in order to help out in terms of in the home level. So whether those campaigns can be reached through social media or in other manners, no? That was the suggestion on ending all forms of violence. Now, sex trafficking is another very, very sensitive and difficult problem to address because basically there is already an industry that revolves around these practices. No? And last 2 years ago, if I may share, I used to teach in Ateneo de Davao class, and one of my students, one of the projects that my students did in the contemporary world, I taught contemporary world there, and the students were assigned to do projects in the community. They visited a home for sexually abused women. I think the name of the NGO was Tahanan ng mga kababaihan or something in that on the lines of that, no? And the NGO was in Davao, and my students basically went there and that they just did a simple project essentially, but it was really full of they really gave their sincere help to the women in that place. Most of the women who were helped by the NGO are sex workers in Davao City and other abused women. So my students gave food to them, and they also took some time to interview some of the women there. And the women basically mentioned that because of poverty, of course, they were sometimes recruited to the city without their knowing that was actually the work that was recruited for them to do. But they mentioned that if there was no demand for such work, then their work would not even exist. And they really just hope that basically the idea was that if people did not actually if there was no demand basically for the work, then this type of work would not even be proliferated in a way. They themselves they felt like they could not get another opportunity in terms of livelihood for their children, because they also had children. Some of them had children to raise, but the fact there was that if these structures are still existing, and we're not saying we are not idealistic in saying that we can actually eliminate these structures altogether, because these are already ingrained for such a long time. Even in the past, these structures have existed. But maybe if we start to teach young people or teach others that these structures are not exactly good for the workers themselves, in that sense, no? It could be stopped as well, to stop sex trafficking altogether and other types of exploitation. So to end all forms of violence against all women and girls. Next would be eliminate all harmful practices such as child, early, and forced marriage and female genital mutilations. This refers to FGM. FGM is a cultural practice that is still being done in the regions of Africa and the Middle East. And basically, the idea, it sounds a little morbid, but to preserve the purity of women, sometimes there is a clipping, no, that is put towards the sex organ of females, which is very harmful, of course, to reproductive health. And with that, here we see that one of the indicators for gender equality is to eliminate such negative, harmful practices, such as, aside from FGM, we also have child, early, and forced marriage. Another indicator for gender equality is to recognize and value unpaid care and domestic work through the provision of public services, infrastructure, and social protection policies, and the promotion of shared responsibility within the household and the family as nationally appropriate. To look at earlier in the video on the United Nations, we saw that there was an illustration of a family, wherein the mother eventually worked and the father helped out in taking care of the children. So some policies that have been done in the Philippines is the Kasambahay law. So the Kasambahay law, although it's not for parents, but it's more on for household help. Now, in the Kasambahay law, household helps, yaya and other household workers are already given a basic salary, and the employer should also ensure that the worker has social security such as SSS, so that they can also have those services, those public services in that level. So that's a policy in the Philippines that has been done. And the promotion as well of shared responsibility. We talked about the household level earlier. One of us discussed about equalizing work at home so that it wouldn't be a burden. Working in household chores would not be a burden towards just the mother, as well as what was mentioned as well in the other lecture video. You know what, class? Like in my level, I did try to help out, of course, in our family. So hopefully, dili na sad kaayo more unequal. Para sa itong i-share ganina sa levels amo ang balay nga magtabang yapon sa toang sa tong mother or sa tong sister, if ever kinsay dagan gabuhaton sa balay. So maybe there could be some things that we learn throughout the weeks that we increasingly applied in our own circumstances in our families. So to measure these, percentage of eligible population covered by national social protection programs, and average number of hours spent on paid and unpaid work combined by sex. So to measure that, there could be a census that can be done in order to measure how many hours each gender has spent in household work. Another indicator for gender equality would be to ensure women's full and effective participation and equal opportunities for leadership at all levels of decision making. So some campaigns can be done or has been done relating to this. For example, I believe that UN Women has also increased campaigns relating to increasing women's full participation in leadership. Then another indicator for gender equality would be ensure universal access to sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights. Now, please note that these indicators doesn't just refer to just women. Hopefully, no, there could also be more representation of the LGBT in the in governance, so full participation in leadership. And another program that can be done, class, just top of our heads, is through media. Hopefully, no. For example, class, in at least in Western media, no, in Western media, a lot of stories about the LGBT have been featured in some major shows, no. If some of you have watched Glee, for example, Glee is a series in 2009 to 2014 or 15, and Glee, in their storylines, they have characters who are gay and lesbian, whom we can see the journeys of these characters in the show, that growing up, the pain that they go through because of bullying, and their families not accepting them. However, it is dramatized, but still, if we see that there is more representation towards stories such as those, and also in the Philippine context, the film Die Beautiful, Born Beautiful, the story that I mentioned earlier, those can also try to mobilize the conversation around LGBT. And gay or transgender politicians, no? So I know that our country is quite conservative in that aspect. I'm not even sure if those would be, of course, accepted by our country, looking at the majority Catholic and Muslim populations in the Philippines. That would definitely be a source of siguro criticism by various sectors. However, even Pope Francis himself, class, has actually acknowledged the difficulties that the LGBT have gone through, and there is already an acknowledgement of the LGBT, although the church itself has very ingrained rules about these aspects, and these are not going to change anytime soon. But just like what City mentioned earlier, I respect them. No? So at least in our level, we accept the fact that we cannot change our religions, but we, in our opinions, as long as we respect these the LGBT
Kasi
and
yung audio mo may putol-putol.
oh, sorry, I think it's the internet. Is that Charles? I think it's the internet because of
Yes, ma'am.
I'm using my mobile data. The internet here is quite slow. Hopefully the recording will be clear. I will just try to upload the recording of the lecture, everyone. So, as mentioned, no, yes, respect and the media. Some increase in the visibility of various gender stories in the media, literature, film, TV. To also increase the participation of various sectors in different sectors. Then another indicator for gender equality would be universal access to sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights. So a case in point in our country would be the reproductive health law, since reproductive health rights is also connected to basically to how we ourselves, or rather our sexual and reproductive health, is addressed as well in the whole policy on gender equality. So this is very important, class, because if we look at, for example, the prevalence of sexually transmitted diseases, which genders are often most prone to getting infected with STDs, no? The campaign for educated use of protection, no, as well as just this also can relate towards family planning, because women, of course, have to carry the burden of it's not a burden essentially, but if it is an unplanned pregnancy, no, in any case, females have to, of course, give birth and bear children. So in that sense, family planning, sexually transmitted diseases, these are very important aspects in society that has to be addressed as well. Teenage pregnancy. So there are various gender dynamics that are ingrained in all of these aspects, no? So that's why it's quite important as well for these issues to be included in the policy on gender equality. So to measure access to sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights programs, some indicators are the prevalence rate of the use of contraceptives, percentage of women who have undergone sexual and reproductive health programs in the community level, for example, and then meeting the demand for family planning. Then next, we have undertake reforms to give women equal rights to economic resources, such as perhaps employment, no? And the use of inheritance. Some programs to promote inheritance on a cultural level, instead of just favoring men, or rather boys in the family. There could be a shift in the culture wherein perhaps females can also be regarded as what's the term there, as worthy, no? As worthy to be an heir, or someone who can inherit the family fortune, for example. But I think that's already happening, of course, in our country. Our country is relatively gender equal in terms of inheritance. However, in rural areas, I think we also mentioned that there is there are still, it's not just in rural areas, but maybe in other countries like in China, no, there is still a huge emphasis on patriarchy, on favoring boy children instead of girl children. So those cultural aspects can also be addressed. To measure those, the measurement would be, or the indicators would be, percentage of women, men, and IPs with secure rights to land. So there could be, not just in land, no, but hopefully also in employment. There could be there would be more females who get hired as well during this time as well, no? And home-based work, as mentioned in the previous lecture, home-based work through the internet has been an opportunity to gain income. Another indicator would be enabling technologies using ICT, as mentioned just now, using the internet for income, and to empower the different genders now through the information that can be taken or that can be learned from the internet. And then lastly, adopt and strengthen sound policies and enforceable legislation for the promotion of gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls. So this would relate towards legislation towards gender equality and in relation to politics. So that would be the discussion essentially for gender equality, and the indicators. There were various indicators mentioned there. These will all be reflected in the quiz assignment that will be assigned. Any questions from the class?